Skaven Tide recently dropped, the 4th edition of Age of Sigmar. If you picked it up, like me, you're going to have 2 complete armies in that box, and the only things that you need to do before you can start playing that game is to build them, and if you want, paint them. A lot of people don't get a lot of enjoyment out of painting the models. Me, I really enjoy it. However, I know that's not the case for a lot of you. In this series of 4 videos, we're going to take a look at how I painted my Stormcast Eternals, and hopefully you'll be able to replicate something similar, or even better, come up with something of your own. Hi everybody, I'm Wayne. So this is it, the first of 4 videos over the next 8 weeks, one every 2 weeks, where I'm going to tackle each part of what made up my Stormcast Eternals. A lot of you have asked me how I actually painted these guys, how I came up with the scheme, and if I do some tutorials on it. And that's exactly what this is going to be. However, I'm going to do it rather than just as a straight tutorial of how to make something that looks like I've come up with. I'm going to take you through each of the individual steps that I came up with to allow me to paint my army as fast as possible and get that army on the tabletop. Hopefully, at the end of this series, you'll have come up with your own scheme and you'll understand the fundamentals of what I'm talking about and how to apply those techniques and theories in practice on your own models using your own colour schemes. The important part here and what to understand is there's no right or wrong way of doing it. These are just guidelines. If you have something that's different, but you take something away from one of the individual steps, that's fantastic. Now, I said there's going to be 4 videos. Let me tell you a little bit about that before we jump right in. The first video is going to be the lion's share of the work. The armour is the bulk of the Stormcast, really, isn't it? I mean, let's face it, unless you're going something a little bit more involved than something like this, it makes up 90% of the model. The really easy thing that I've come up with of how I do my scheme is that the majority of that armour paint job is done in a couple of steps. It's really not difficult at all. But you can get so much more out of it if you understand the fundamental techniques of what I'm talking about. And each of those techniques, as we go through each of the 4 steps, builds on each other to give us a really good, vibrant finish at the end. And if it's the OSL that you're looking for, that's going to be the 3rd video in the series. Now, all of these things, as I say, do build on top of each other. Let's get in, let's look at the armour today, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. I'm going to try and make this a little bit different, so rather than the usual painting video where you just see my hands and me talking about things, I'm going to use diagrams as we go through each and every step of the way and try and explain not only what we're going to do, but why we're doing it and how that will impact further stages down the line. So this is Steve. Steve the Stormcast is looking a little bit bland at the moment. It's just some black and white line art, but it's going to help us visualize what we're going to do. And I would really encourage you to plan out what is you're going to do for all of your projects, especially if you're painting an army in one go. It really does help set that process and get you on the right path of creating a quick and efficient scheme. So with that in mind, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to prime as models black. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Steve. I'm going to use a couple of test models in the first instance here. So I'm going to use a standard Liberator from the new Skaven Tide box set. It's one of the new armor types. And I'm also going to use this model from the Stormcast Chariot. So you'll notice that there's some material on this as well. We'll be using that in some of the later tutorials down the road. But for now, all we're doing is looking at the armor. So I'm going to be flipping backwards and forwards between these 2 models throughout the course of these few videos. Right. Let's talk about the primer, what I've used. I use a really cheap Rattlecan primer. I've been using this for the past couple of years now, and I find I get really good results for it. You can use whatever you want. The brand, I find, doesn't matter. Use whatever you're comfortable with. If you've got some Citadel cans, great, use that. Vallejo, Gameforge, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just paint your model black. Make sure you hit it from all of the angles. You don't have to paint right from underneath if you don't want to, unless you're going to be flipping your models upside down. I choose to. I like to get a good coat over the entire model, and that sets the foundation for every subsequent step in the process. Do it outside, ideally. Make sure your cans are shaken well. I'm not going to teach you how to prime models. It's pretty straightforward. Hopefully you've used the rattle cans before. Once you've done that, we can get on to the first proper step in this process. But before we do, let's have a chat about what that's going to be. With this first proper step, what we're going to do is find a gunmetal silver. It doesn't matter again about the brand. I'm going to use Citadel's Lead Belcher because I had a half of a can kicking around, but you can use any gunmetal paint. It doesn't really matter. What you don't want to do is something too bright at this point. So a mid silver but gunmetal, something with a little bit of dark grey or black in it is what you really want here. And what we're going to do is hit it at a 45-degree angle over the top of that black prime. Once we've done the 45-degree angle, what we're going to do then is just hit the model from the top and do a direct zenithal down over the top of it. Just a light coat of it, because what we don't want to do is saturate the entire model. What we're trying to do here, and as we can see from the diagram, is get a gradation going from a dark grey down to the lighter coloured bottom half of the model where we've not got quite as much of the paint on there. And obviously we don't want to obscure any of those deep dark black shadows that we established by using that black undercoat. Now the point in that is contrast. That's what this entire scheme is based around. So remember that going forwards, because we'll be coming back to it later on in future videos. I found the key to good rattle can technique is to depress the nozzle before you actually reach the model. That way you don't get any splattering on there. Nice even coats will give you the best coverage. So I'm going from the side, as I said, and then the 45-degree from the top, just to increase the saturation at the top of the model to give us that brighter finish at the top and a darker one at the bottom, a very subtle gradation. So much like with the silver, I'm using half of a can of Retributor Armour that I had left kicking around. Do use whatever you've got to hand. Any gold will do. Really, you don't want something that's too bright, but pretty much any gold paint at this point will do for this paint scheme. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the model from directly above. Quite a light coat. We don't want to saturate it. All we really want to do is give a dusting of gold to the uppermost parts of the model. Really, we want to try and keep the lower extremities silver. Okay, so light coat at the top. That's step one of this phase. And then step two, what we're going to do is we're going to come in from the side and we're just going to hit the top almost quarter, perhaps even less, just the head and the upper shoulders with a side-on coat of the gold paint, just to bring the vibrancy up. So we're building up that gradation down the model from gold all the way down to silver at the bottom. If you're doing an entire army of these, your can control will get much better over time. Just remember, thin, light coats, start depressing the nozzle before you hit the model. It's so much easier to add paint than take away. Don't forget, top down zenithal coat, and then we come back in and just the top bit of the model, the head and the shoulders, with another light pass just to increase that saturation and vibrancy. And as you can see, this is what we ended up with, the Liberator and this Chariot Driver. Now, that's the majority of the armour pretty much done. Everything else is dead straightforward. That's it, we're done with the rattle cans now. We're back to just standard brushes and paints for now. What I'm going to use is gunmetal again, in this case Vallejo Game Colour Metallic Gunmetal, and what I'm going to do is re-establish the gunmetal colour on the model where we want that to be the predominant colour. So things like the weapons, any chainmail or plate mail on it, any other bits and pieces that you particularly want to be silver later on, let's hit them with this. So here we see I'm doing the arrow tip, the weapon of the Stormcast Liberator, the hammers. Don't worry, this is super fast. I'm using a big old brush here. I think this is a size 6. Just get the paint slapped on. You don't have to be overly neat, just try not to get on the gold areas. You should be in a fairly good position at this point, and we should have something that's pretty much a close approximation to the diagram of Stephen here. Right, the next thing then that we want to do is bring that highlight up a little bit further, just on the head and the top of the shoulders. That's going to give us a little bit more contrast, a little bit more visual interest that's going to help us in later stages. Now we're going to do that by introducing another gold Any gold will do, just so long as it's lighter than the Retributor armor that we used before. If you've only got Retributor armor, mix it with a little bit of silver. Anything like that will do, just so long as it's a value higher than the current value. And we're just going to apply it to the top of the head, top of the shoulders, perhaps the upper pec, and a little bit of the back. Go with what you think looks good here. Rule of cool is what you need to follow. As you can see, I'm using polished gold here from Vallejo, and I'm just going to apply it again using the same size 6 brush just to the top of the head, a little bit of the shoulder pads, a little bit of the upper chest, and I'm doing it really fast. I'm not really giving any attention to detail whatsoever. Just get it on there. Sorry about the blurring there, the camera went a little bit funky, but you can see me just putting it straight on with pretty much reckless abandon, just on any of the high points, top quarter of the model, if that. Not bothering too much about where it goes. Don't worry, we're going to clean this up later on. Now we're going to grab a bright silver, something like steel or aluminium, or you can use both if you want to put an extra step in, but something around this tone will work fine. I'm going to go with steel. What we're going to do in this step is pick out a couple of key details on his model. On this Liberator, I'm going to pick the bottom and the top of the hammers out, just to give it a little bit more visual interest, but more importantly, to increase the contrast in the weapon, because later on, in subsequent steps, that's really going to help us out to sell the effect of the lightning. Use the rule of cool here. If you don't want to paint these parts how I'm painting them in the bright steel colour, then choose some other parts, or none at all. It's entirely up to you. At this point you could also pick out a few additional details if you wanted with the silver. I've chosen the belt buckles, and I've done a small amount of edge highlighting just on the lower bits of plate mail as well. Just a tiny little dot of silver, nothing more, because I don't want to detract the viewer's eye from the top of the model where the brightest part's going to be. That will detract later on. We're almost done with the armor now. Now this step is purely optional, you don't have to do it. On the left here you can see the Archer has not been dry brushed and the Liberator on the right had been dry brushed. It's a selective dry brush. We're going to use the same steel colour that we used before, just a bright silver and a light dry brush from the top of the model down to the bottom. Ideally, don't go too heavy on the bottom of the model because you don't want to detract from the top part. This is just going to set us up for the next stage. Now, you can go through this fairly fast. At this point, a Stormcast is looking fairly shiny, and if you like that look, then you could leave it at this step, and that wouldn't be a problem, and just go on to the materials and the OSL. However, if you want to get that darker, grim, filth look that makes him look a little bit more worn, and what really sells the effect, then what we're going to do is use a filter. If you've not done this before, it's a really simple technique of using a paint over the top of this paint. In this case, we're going to use an enamel paint to filter the entire model's colour down a couple of values. Now, using an enamel paint is a little bit different to using an acrylic paint, and we're going to use white spirit to remove it in the next step. All I'm going to do is apply AK Interactive's brown enamel wash all over the entire miniature and then let it dry. Not too long, just for about half an hour or so. And what that's going to do is stain the entire surface of the model. Even where we've removed it, there will be a slight staining, bringing the values down, making it a little bit duller, but we can re-establish those highs later on. And again, this is playing into the theme of contrast, and that's what sells the overall effect of this, is that contrast between bright and dark. As models dry, we're fully tinted. Now all we need to do is remove some of what we've put on to reveal what's underneath, and we're going to do that using something like a makeup sponge, or one of these Q-tips is what I use, with a little bit of mineral spirit or white spirit. Then we gently rotate the bud and we remove some of the enamel paint that we've just put on, revealing the highlights. Now we do that as we've done the entire process from the top down. We want the top to be lighter and the bottom to be darker, giving us that contrast that's so important in this theme. I think it is worth noting that with this step, it can be destructive. Since we've not varnished in the previous step, if you're too heavy-handed here and you start scrubbing with the Q-tip, you will remove layers of paint underneath the enamel, and that's not what we want to do. So make sure that you're constantly swapping out your Q-tips if it starts to get damaged and frayed like the one in the video here. And do make sure that the tip is damp, not soaking wet. You don't want to have pools of mineral spirit on your model, just damp enough so that it's easy enough to remove the enamel paint. And how much you want to remove is entirely up to you. It's totally subjective and personal preference. I tend to leave the bottom fairly untouched and concentrate on the top. Obviously, what you do find with this step is it brings out the details in the model. It gets in the recesses, so if you only want to take the top layer off and leave the darker recesses, then you will start to see more details of the models emerge. Now, that can be a plus or a minus depending on the look that you're going for. This next stage will let you emphasize or de-emphasize that. If you want to include it, great. If you don't have to. It's a purely optional step. Steve, if you don't mind giving us a hand again. I would recommend you wait around 24 hours for the enamel to completely dry before moving on to this step though. What we're going to do is pick out a couple of key details, specifically any straps, pouches, and the Under Armour that the Stormcast wear. I'm going to use a brown for the belts and straps, and I'm going to use a deep, warm grey for the Under Armour. It's probably worth dropping down to a smaller brush size for this section. I've gone down to a size 4, it's a little bit of a sharper tip, and I'm just using a Vallejo Game Colour Smoke. It goes on very, very smoothly. It takes a couple of coats to get to the level of opacity that I want, but being acrylic, it is translucent, and that does help us maintain the highlights we've already built up. Do try and be as neat as you can at this point. We don't want to mess up any of the good work we've already done. Take your time and you'll get through it. In this step of the tutorial, we're going to pick out a couple of details and apply our accent colour of choice. In my case, I've gone with the purple. Now, I'm going to use a purple ink. You could use something like a contrast paint if you don't have any inks, or even a normal thin down acrylic. The reason, however, that I'm using inks is that they're very highly pigmented, and that's going to give the vibrancy of colour that I want, especially over the dulled down base that we've created with the enamel. I don't want it too bright, but I don't want it to be absolutely washed out either. Now, we're going to get a different finish depending on where we apply it over the armour. And in the next step, in the material stage, we're going to use a complementing colour to this. In my case, I'm going to use a darker purple. So this is going to end up being a little bit more like a lighter purple or a pinky violet, but that's absolutely the look that we're going for. And as you can see, Steve is modelling it really well. It looks great on you, Steve. One of the real benefits of using inks over, say, something like Citadel's Contrast or the Vallejo Speed Paints, most inks tend to have a satin finish. So when we're using them like this to coat over the top of a metallic, it maintains the sheen. So it does look like it's much more like a coloured metal than a painted metal, which is what we want. This is exactly the kind of thing that you would use perhaps on a gun tip to show that barrel burn, or you could use it like this to create quite a vibrant coloured metal. Here we are at the final step. I'm using Citadel's Runelord Brass. We're going to use this to give the edges of the armour a really light, dry brushed highlight. If you don't have this particular colour, don't worry, just use a gold with a little bit of silver in it. But if you do have this colour, it's absolutely perfect for what we call polishing the gold. It's really difficult to show in this video quite how lightly I'm touching the model now. You should see it just picking out the very top edges of the armour, and we're only doing it right at the top of the model. The head, the upper shoulders, a little bit of the back, and perhaps a little bit of the upper chest, but that's it. And it really does make the model pop. And with this step done, that's it. The armour is finished. With that then, we're done. The armour's completely finished now. The beauty of this scheme is it lets you get an entire army tabletop ready really fast. It's not overly complicated in terms of details, and it gives you the flexibility to choose whatever colours you want, applying them in the method that I've demonstrated in this video to be able to create a diverse range of storm hosts. So that's the armour done and dusted. Step 1, tick, well done. If you followed along step by step, that's great. If you didn't, but you've understood the process of what I'm trying to tell you how to do, of how I create a scheme, that's going to really help you out in the long run. Hopefully, it'll help you get your army on the tabletop faster and you can get rolling some dice. Next video, we're going to tackle the materials. I went with purple, you might go with something different, but we're going to get a textured finish to those materials and hopefully it'll fit in with your colour scheme. If you enjoyed this video, then do give me a subscribe. If you liked it, fantastic, great. Give me a thumbs up and let me know. If you like the format of the videos, then do let me know that as well down in the comment. It really helps the channel grow. And that's what I want to do. I just want to give back to the community. Okay, guys, I'll see you in next week's video, and then we'll carry on with part 2 in a couple of weeks' time. See ya.